South Sudan came into existence in 2011, but deeply embedded in the history of its formation is the story of John Garang Demabio, a Sudanese leader and former rebel commander of the Sudan People's Liberation Army, the SPLA. Garang was a charismatic military leader who spent more than 20 years at the helm of the SPLA and was really a thorn in the side of the Sudanese government, including that of the dictator Omar al-Bashir. Sudan had always been a troubled nation plagued by peripheral rebellions since before its birth in 1956. So John Garang thought he had the cure for this. He called it the New Sudan, a democratic, secular, and united nation where power and wealth would be shared across its vast landscape and diverse people, both Christians and Muslims, African and Arab. This was the cause that he and his group were fighting for, and what ensued was a brutal 22-year-long civil war which finally ended when the government of Sudan and John Garang signed the Comprehensive Peace Agreement. All of this was before John Garang's tragic death in July of 2005. In this episode of African Biographics, we look at the life story of John Garang, the Sudanese rebel leader of the SPLA. John Garang Demabio was born in Buk, a tiny village of the Dinka people in Bor County on the east bank of the Nile River. He once said that no one in his village was even able to read. By the time he was 10 years old, he was orphaned and might have stayed in Bor County for the rest of his life, becoming a cattle herder like his father and grandfather before him. But his life changed when a relative sent him to school, first in the nearby Wau village, then across the Nile River in the village of Rumbek. In 1962, at the age of 17, young John attempted to join the Anyanya uprising in southern Sudan, but he was encouraged by its leaders to continue his secondary education in Tanzania. This was all during the First Sudanese Civil War, a 12-year conflict between the northern and southern regions of Sudan that had started in 1955. The Anyanya were a southern Sudanese separatist rebel army formed during this war. When he finished high school, young John won a scholarship to Grinnell College in Iowa in the United States, and in 1969 he graduated with a Bachelor of Science degree in economics. Garang was offered a graduate fellowship at the University of California at Berkeley, but instead he returned to Tanzania as a research fellow at the University of Dar es Salaam, but was soon back in Sudan with the Anyanya. Following the Addis Ababa Peace Agreement of 1972, when the then Sudanese president Hassan Aimeri brought the first phase of the civil war in Sudan to an end, Garang and members of the Anyanya were integrated into the Sudanese army. For the next 11 years, John Garang's career in the military saw him rise from captain to colonel, and he also completed an advanced course at the United States Army Infantry School in Fort Benning, Georgia. John Garang then took a 4-year break to study for a master's degree in agricultural economics and a PhD in economics at Iowa State University. Upon his return to Sudan in 1981, Garang found that the country had changed incredibly since the time he left, and here is why. In a bid to hold on to power as his popularity steadily declined, President Hassan Aimeri was trying to appease the Islamic fundamentalists by introducing Sharia law throughout the country, even in the predominantly Christian and animist South. Given what had transpired, Garang realized that the peace agreement of 1972 was doomed. At the same time, the company Chevron had discovered oil in Sudan in the southern regions. This was in the late 1970s. As a result of this, some northern politicians attempted to redraw provincial boundaries so that the oil fields could be relocated in the north. Unsurprisingly, the Southerners were indeed disgruntled by all of this, and they felt that they had to do something. By 1982, there were renewed outbreaks of fighting in the south, with rebels mounting attacks upon the army. When an army mutiny took place at Bor County in the south, President Hassan Aimeri sent John Garang to quell this uprising. However, Garang instead swapped sides and formed the Sudan People's Liberation Movement, the SPLM, and their military wing, the SPLA. More than 2 months later, John Garang reappeared in Ethiopia, where the leader of the country at the time, Mengistu Haile Mariam, gave him and the SPLA full support, with the rebellious Bor garrison as the nucleus of this new movement. Mengistu's regime supported the cause of the Southern Sudanese in retaliation for the Sudanese government's support for Eritrean secessionists and Tigrayan rebels in Ethiopia who were causing trouble for Mengistu. Knowing that Mengistu was already fighting a separatist movement in Eritrea, Garang understood that his movement, the SPLA, could not style itself as separatist. Mengistu supported a united, secular and socialist Sudan. In Libya, Gaddafi, who had once supported the Eritreans but who switched sides when Mengistu came to power, joined Mengistu in supporting the Southern Sudanese. All this to say that the SPLA movement had strong backing from some powerful quarters. Anyways, Garang spent the rest of the year 1983 launching attacks by the SPLA against government targets in the south, and in turn was able to halt drilling for oil by Chevron, which had only recently commenced. Within a few months and even well into the middle of the 1980s, thousands of young Nuer and Dinka, the two largest ethnic groups in the south, joined Garang's SPLA and flocked to western Ethiopia for military training. The SPLA trained and deployed many battalions that captured scores of towns in Upper Nile and Equatoria, victories that resulted in more recruits from different ethnic groups in the south. In 1984, the SPLA set up a radio station in Ethiopia called Radio SPLA in order to broadcast into Sudan. John Garang gave his first radio address on the 3rd of March 1984, calling upon all the Sudanese people to abolish the divisions among them that the oppressor had imposed through the policy of divide and rule. This call for an inclusive Sudan ideologically appealed to marginalized Sudanese in the geographical northern Sudan and to some Arab intellectuals. That same year, 1984, by which time John Garang wanted to overthrow Nimeri and form a socialist government in Sudan, Khafa Nimeri attempted to appease John by offering him the vice presidency and making him coordinator of development in the south. But John Garang refused. On 16 April 1985, the Sudanese military, under General Suwa al-Dahab, mounted a coup and overthrew Khafa Nimeri. Following this, Garang ordered a ceasefire, but when he learned of Dahab's plan for the south, he renewed the war. A year later, in April of 1986, a civilian government under Sadiq al-Mahdi came to power. Sadiq al-Mahdi offered Garang a place on his Council of Ministers, but John Garang refused. Talks between Garang and Sadiq were held in Addis Ababa during July of 1986, but they did not reach any agreement. The SPLA regarded the so-called democratic period under Sadiq al-Mahdi as another northern dictatorship, and so the war raged on. In the years that followed, especially between 1986 and 1989, Garang made a number of territorial gains in the south, but the plight of the people there worsened, with many starving as a result of the war. The government in Khartoum also retaliated by recruiting militia forces to destabilize the civilian population in the south. In May of 1989, John Garang announced a one-month ceasefire so as to allow discussions about freezing the proposed imposition of Sharia law. However, this effort at finding a solution was thrown into disarray and eventually fell through following the 1989 coup d'etat, which brought General Omar al-Bashir to power. Al-Bashir and Dr. Hassan al-Turabi moved the country towards Islamic fundamentalism. Following this, John Garang made it clear that he didn't like the direction that al-Bashir and Turabi were taking the country, so the war continued. By 1990, the war was raging on, causing heavy human distress, and many thousands of refugees were created by the fighting. The SPLA also lost its chief financial backer when, in the spring of 1991, Mengistu's regime was overthrown.